elevating the discussion while talking about the things that matter most. You're listening to Society and the State, Life, Liberty, and Your Pursuit of Happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. We are joined by Matt Kibbe, formerly of FreedomWorks, who's now doing some very innovative messaging and videos trying to reach a very broad audience with important messages. And we want to talk a little bit how we market those messages to millennials specifically, but I think also in a day where we are driven by sound bites and social media, and it's tough to get through the fray to reach people. So Matt, appreciate you coming on today to join us.
Connor, good talking to you.
So I know Brian's got a lot of questions too, but since I opened us up here, I'm gonna start first. What is so different about millennials? Why is it that we have to kind of craft a different way to talk to them, to deliver messages that resonate with them? You seem to have hit kind of a good stride in coming up with content and messaging that appeals to this younger generation. What's the secret sauce that you've been working on?
You know, I think if you look at the world that millennials grew up in, it's radically different than the world I grew up in because everything is democratized. Everything is no longer sort of spoon-fed to us from 3 TV networks or 2 political parties, and they live online. They live through technology, and they curate their entire existence. They even curate their own communities. They curate their own friends, and they certainly have an infinite number of choices when it comes to news, information, and entertainment. And that, to me, it's almost like a radically libertarian dream come true because they're immersed in choice. And I remember the old days just a few years ago when critics of entitlement reform would tell us that too many choices, meaning 2 or 3 choices, would overwhelm young people. And I laugh at that because I think 1 minute every day, for all those minutes, they're making tens of thousands, millions of choices. So in that world, there's a challenge on how you connect with people. It's not, the upside is that information distribution is really cheap through Facebook, through other social media means.
Right.
The downside is that there's a million places that anyone can go. So you have to compete for their attention. You have to find ways to tell a story instead of the old days when you'd sort of post a 40-minute policy lecture in hopes that someone would watch it.
So this is an interesting question as it relates to a question that I'm sure you've heard. I get this from time to time, but as we're talking about it, and as you just talked about, being immersed in choice, it strikes me that I don't really hear this question from anyone under 30. And that question is, what news source do you trust? So I found that older folks, maybe it's because they did grow up with fewer selections. They were used to, relying on one given outlet or newspaper. And when they find that, I can't trust the media, or they're, incorrectly relating, what's happening, they're biased. And so they then gravitate and say, well, who should I listen to? What website, what news source should I trust? It occurs to me that I've never heard that question from anyone under 30. And would you suspect that it is because the rising generation is used to not having these single or limited options, that they're used to just having many inputs of information?
Yeah, and I think I never thought of that, but to take it one step further, they may be anti-trusted sources, and I know this is particularly true in politics, where millennials, by a large margin, are registering. To the extent they register to vote at all, they're registering as independents, and they sort of have a visceral reaction against this is an official message from the Republican Party. This is an official message from a trusted political source. They think that that's all BS, and they might be right about that.
So, Matt, we hear the term generation gap, and every one of us kind of forms an image in our mind of what that might look like. But I wonder if I could get you to expound a little bit your opinion. What is it that makes millennials see the world differently than the baby boomers or Gen X? Is it something besides just, the digital revolution that has shaped their worldview?
Well, they have more information. I think they're by definition more cosmopolitan. They get to see the world through Facebook in a way that I couldn't have imagined when I was a kid. I would read books and try to imagine these faraway places, and you not only have friends in those places today, but you're watching video, and you're literally a citizen of the world in a way that I think again is got a libertarian feel to it. But more fundamentally, they also grew up at a time when government was losing their trust. They grew up seeing Wall Street bailed out. They grew up hearing politicians saying one thing, but immediately being able to fact check them and discovering that they weren't telling the truth at all. Again, in the old days, it used to be quite typical for a U.S. senator, we won't name any names, to say one thing back in his home state and another thing and do another thing in Washington, D.C. And the reality is you just don't get away with that anymore. So it's created all of this liberation. But on the other hand, they're quite cynical. And they're cynical because they've seen top-down institutions fail before their eyes. They've seen this duplicity that happens so often in our politics, and they react against that. They're drawn to sort of radical experiments like democratic socialism because they know whatever's wrong with it. They know the current system's not quite right.
Matt, a moment ago you mentioned that if the millennial generation is registering to vote at all, they're increasingly registering as an independent. And that jives with my perception that a lot of millennials try and, in whatever way they can, whether it's, voter registration or in just what information they consume, what networks they're in, they're opting out of partisanship. They don't buy into this duopoly of politics. They think there's a different or a better way. And it seems to me that your videos, so let's shift into that. Talk to us about some of the videos you've been making recently, what you're doing with your new organization. And it seems to me that you've been trying to appeal to this audience in a way that crosses these default partisan lines, that resonates with them intellectually and emotionally. Has this been intentional that you've focused on this audience, or is that part of kind of a larger plan that you guys are doing?
Well, we commissioned a blue chip study and discovered that young people live a lot longer than old people. So it made a heck of a lot of sense to focus on them. That's a joke, by the way. But yeah, it sounds cliche, but it's obviously true. The next generation will define what our country is and what it becomes very quickly. And I see that the trends of this strong libertarian streak. So I think there's an opportunity to talk to this generation about the values that I think are so profoundly American. They're profoundly human. And for some reason, we've just never been able to fully connect on those. And I think part of it is our natural tendency to skip the story, skip the emotional argument for why it is we believe that freeing up healthcare from bureaucrats is better for patients, and we go straight to the spreadsheet and the downward sloping demand curve, and we just lose our audience. I discovered this spending some time with some progressive colleagues behind closed doors in strategy meetings, and I quickly realized how tribal their language was. They used all of these terms that I really didn't understand, even though they were speaking perfect English. And I would go back and hang out with my libertarian friends, and more than ever realize that we do the same thing. It's not English. It's secret handshakes and acronyms and funny words that we lifted from the footnotes of human action. So none of that stuff makes sense if you're trying to tell a story and you have 2 to 3 minutes to do it. So at Free the People, we're very conscious of language. We're very experimental with language because the goal is to find ways to connect with young people that may have nothing to do with your habits of speaking about things. The goal is to find those shared values. The goal is not to impress them with your vocabulary. So that's it's a very experimental approach, but social media is very much built that way. You can test things, you can measure things, you can let the crowd tell you what they're responding to and adjust accordingly.
Matt, I'm glad you mentioned the obstacle that tribalism presents. I know you've written and you've actually warned about falling into the deadly isms and how we get caught up in labels and can use those to, dismiss people or otherwise shut them out. I wonder if I could get you to tell us about the political spectrum and how we might better envision it to have a better understanding of how it really plays out.
Yeah, this started. We've launched this new series called The Deadly Isms, and it started with my frustration with the traditional political spectrum that we were all taught in high school that runs left to right, and on the far left you have communism and socialism, and on the far right you have fascism and other sorts of authoritarianism, and I never quite understood how that made any sense, because from my point of view, you look at Pol Pot, who was a self-described socialist Marxist. He was a radical nationalist. One of the first things he did when he took over Cambodia was clean Cambodia of Chinese and Vietnamese immigrants. He didn't want the pure experiment in socialism to be tainted with the blood of other types of people. And that's, to me, sounds a little bit like Hitler. So if Pol Pot's on the far left and Adolf Hitler's on the far right, it strikes me that the spectrum is fundamentally flawed. So the theory is that all forms of authoritarianism, all the deadly isms, from fascism to communism to socialism to nationalism and progressivism, and you can work your way up the food chain, that's all in the bottom. That's about too much government power. That's about the potential of the horrible things that happen when dictators presume that they know better and are willing to use the power to enforce those bad ideas. And up from that is liberty and cooperation and community and people working together to solve problems through voluntary association. And that, to me, it's not a partisan thing. It's not a left or right thing. And I think as a self-described libertarian, I almost find myself feeling like I'm sitting in the middle as I look at the two extremes emerging in politics today, whether it be white nationalism on the right or Antifa on the far left. And I'm like, I'm none of those things. Mm-hmm. And in a weird way, I feel like a moderate today, but it's not left and right. It's down or up.
Matt, in your efforts to educate millennials specifically, but kind of the rising generation more broadly, how do we do that in an era of highly educated ignorance? And by that I mean, you see these man on the street videos that some high school and college folks have done from time to time, where they'll go interview high school seniors or college graduates, and the literacy rate, the not the standard literacy rate, but the political literacy rate or historical literacy, understanding of, they'll even ask them, like, who did we fight in the Revolutionary War and the South, right? Like, and so I find that the school system, maybe it's the John Taylor Gatto approach where this is intentional, we're being dumbed down, but we find ourselves having to interact with and reach out to people who, in my experience, don't really understand the very names and historical figures you just mentioned of these deadly isms. You're starting almost from scratch. Has that been a challenge, and what are you doing about it?
It is a challenge, and I don't know how much of it is the failure of our educational system and how much of it is the natural state of being for busy people that have limited amount of time to focus on issues of politics and public policy and political ideology. But the answer has to be to tell better stories, to create engaging content that is easily easily consumed and something that you want to share with your friends. So don't start with an hour-long lecture on the horrors of the Great Leap Forward under Mao Zedong. Start with a 2 to 3 minute video saying, you probably don't know this, but this horrible thing happened in China because of an experiment with Marxist ideology. And some of these are pretty devastatingly dark stories. But again, I was inspired by this by seeing a poll that you probably saw that showed that so few millennials knew who Mao Zedong was. Did they know Lenin? Did they know Stalin? Did they have positive or negative opinions about them? They generally just didn't know.
I wonder, though, I mean, it's tough because I find that as we reach out to these people, there's a difficulty in dealing with complex issues of importance in sound bites. I guess I worry about forever reducing our messages, our ideas into a really condensed format. But on the flip side, let me actually validate what you said and argue against myself here. The thing that pulled me into politics and history and economics was a story. I was 26 years old. I was invited to watch a screening of a then new documentary called America, Freedom to Fascism. I had no idea what it was about. I show up, and the stories in there of people fighting the income tax and what they were going through specifically really intrigued me and got me learning a lot more. And so I guess the benefit of the sound bites or the storytelling is not that becomes the basis through which we're providing all their education about these all important ideas. You're saying, I think, that these are the hooks. These are how we pull people in. Is that right?
Yeah, I think the short stories are a gateway drug. If you do it well, and it's an engaging story, and it's going to make the viewer want to dig a little bit deeper, and they have vast resources in front of them. The series that I mentioned earlier, The Deadly Isms, is in fact more of a mini documentary format that digs a little bit deeper. So think about it as a step process where short social media videos, even memes on Instagram, all of these are ways to intrigue people enough to spend a little bit more of their time finding out what the full story is. And ultimately at the end of that breadcrumb trail, maybe there is a book, maybe there's a copy of Human Action or some other important book that you and I read once we were introduced to the ideas. But I have a similar story to you. I was introduced to these ideas reading the liner notes on a rock album, and it was dedicated to the genius of Ayn Rand, and I eventually stumbled across one of her short novels called Anthem, and I just followed the breadcrumbs, but it was a series of accidents.
It's interesting to me to think about it in that way too, because you've influenced countless people, and had you not come across, those lyrics, that liner, had you not come across Ayn Rand, who knows what your life would be like today, right? Who knows what your impact would have been? And it really speaks to the importance of finding ways to hook more people in, because who knows who we will influence and thereby who they will influence. And there's a lot of important ability there.
Right now I just added this up for a proposal, but we've produced hundreds of videos in the 18 months that Free the People has existed, and they've been viewed over 80 million times. Most of that is organic. They've been shared. I forget how many times they've been shared, but and of course the share is a better measure. But they've been viewed in 140 countries, and I told a story earlier about Cambodia. I had a chance to be meeting with Liberty folks in Mumbai through the Atlas Network, and a young guy that was running a startup think tank in Cambodia. Well, think about that for a second. If we're worried about our challenges today,
right.
His dad successfully survived Pol Pot by hiding from him, because he was one of the business class people that were being executed summarily in the streets. So the impact is global, and we're going to interview him as well. So you have this tremendous multiplier effect now that used to be really sticky in the sense that you had to stumble across that rock album and you had to then accidentally find that book, and eventually you could go to the library and do the research. Now with social media, you get that multiplier effect in 24 hours if you're doing it right.
So, Matt, it's fashionable in some circles to kind of lean on the millennials or pick on them and say, well, they're a bunch of snowflakes. And anyway, we look down our noses, some of us who are a little bit longer in the tooth. But I'd like to get your assessment. Do you have a sense of optimism for what the millennial generation is likely to do? Are you seeing hopeful signs?
I'm more optimistic today than I've ever been, and I've been fighting for liberty in one sense or another since I was in college, so my entire life. And it's always been a form of guerrilla warfare, a form of cadre building. We were always this teeny little remnant. Hayek was hiding at the top of Mount Pelerin, and maybe there was a dozen freedom fighters, and then there were hundreds, and now there's thousands. But I view this generation. I don't pick on this generation. I think they have a lot of reasons to be bitter and cynical about what politics has delivered for them. I think they are our best hope, and I think we have to approach this community with a lot of humility. We don't go in thinking we know the best thing to do. We go in listening and having a conversation and trying to understand where they're coming from. And there's all sorts of things to worry about. And I mentioned democratic socialism, the lack of respect for free speech and the First Amendment. These are all very concerning things. I'm not sure they're new to millennials. I think Americans have always been conflicted about the question of speech and presidential power, and you see much of this is partisan. If the other side's saying it, you don't like it, but when your side's saying it, you suddenly rediscover the First Amendment. That's not new with millennials. Maybe it's exacerbated and extenuated. That's not even a word, but we'll use it anyway.
I like it. Matt,
by the internet.
Final question for you. I chuckle about the title of I think it's your most recent book, right? Don't Hurt People and Don't Take Their Stuff, or have you done one since?
Nope, that's the most recent.
So, I do these Tuttle Twins books for children, and the thing that I found most curious in working on these is, in many ways, for these youngsters, I'm really just helping them validate the things that that any good parent is already teaching their child, which is basically summarized in the title of your book: Don't Hurt People, don't take their stuff. And it seems that as we get older, society, the establishment, media, politics, encumbers those basic social rules with exceptions. Oh yeah, well, you can take people's stuff if they're suspected of drugs through civil asset forfeiture, or you can hurt them if they're alleged to be really bad, then we can execute them or whatever. And so there's all these exceptions that come into play later on. But in my experience working at the children's level, is like, well, no, actually, those important rules apply just as much in society or across the world as they do between your siblings. And so it strikes me that that's a message that resonates with millennials as well, that, we've been taught this all our life, but in a way, folks like you and I are coming to the table to say, well, wait a minute, these rules still apply, and here's how it matters to the issues that matter to you. Am I wrong?
I think that's precisely right. And I used to joke that I stole the title of that book from your mom's mom, because that's precisely what your mom was taught, and it's precisely what she taught you. But it was an attempt to boil down all 700 plus pages of Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments into a tweet. And it's really just common sense rules that hold civil society together. And as we grow up and we get more sophisticated and we start to create all these rationales and exceptions, I think we lose track of the values that hold us together. So I think you're precisely right. And I think when it comes down to it, if we can boil these down to common values and connect at that level, we're going to find a lot of people across the political spectrum finding common ground.
I like it. So, Matt, we're going to link to all of your book and Free the People and your most recent video on today's show notes page. For the listeners, that's at societyandthestate.com/34. Hope everyone goes to check you out. You guys are doing great work. Matt, we really appreciate you joining us today.
Okay, thanks, guys. This was great.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.